Hi everyone, I am Trish McQueen and I was going to be co-presenting with my colleague from Thriving Families, Carrie, and I'm actually here on my own today. So a little bit about me is I have been working with Thriving Families for over a year now as a family support worker, and I'm also a fully qualified 3 to 18 additional support needs teacher. I have a long background in supporting young people, children and young people and families. I've been doing that for over 30 years with children, and I have been a teacher for 18 years this year. And so I am very passionate about getting it right for everyone, for young people. And it's been really interesting actually taking on a family support worker role with Thriving Families, because I've got to see it from the parent's perspective before working and engaging with schools and trying to help out around these things. And usually I'm doing it from the other side. And so I still do work as a teacher. I work for Highland Council as a teacher. And as you know, Thriving Families is also funded by Highland Council. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. I have a little bit of background as well in initial teacher education programmes, so I am quite used to doing presentations. But this is the first presentation I've ever done online, so apologies if anything goes awry, and I'll try and fix it as best I can. So I'm just going to move on. I'm going to give us a little comfort break halfway through roughly the presentation, just to let people grab a cup of tea or a glass of water or go below. Okay. So I'm only going to touch on the legal stuff actually, because I've put in here in the presentation some QR codes, and that they'll be available. The presentation will be available to you, and you can look these things up. And so remembering that the purpose for additional support needs for learning. So additional support for learning is a legal framework. It is legislation in Scotland, and it is about identifying children and young people who have barriers to their learning and making sure that we provide the necessary support to help them achieve their potential. And that can be done by collaborating with everyone, with the child at the very heart and the centre of this, as Gurfek highlights. That's the correct way to do it, and looking at the child's life within school, within the wider community and at home. And so having a really holistic view of this young person's life and looking at additional support needs around that. Now, the definition of additional support needs is highlighted here. So the main definition is, for whatever reason, a child or young person is or is likely to be unable without the provision of additional support to benefit from school education provided or to be provided. So additional support needs legislation, and I need to make this very clear because this is something that people tend to get wrong, and it's people throughout, like parents, some other professionals, don't quite understand sometimes that additional support needs is absolutely not diagnosis based in Scotland at all. It's based on meeting needs. So you need to identify the needs and the barriers to learning, like it says here, and then figure out strategies that are going to meet those needs. None of that has anything to do with a diagnosis, and if children are being supported correctly in their school and home and community environments, then a diagnosis shouldn't change the support. And this is a difficult one to wrap your head around, because I know a lot of times, and I work with parents who will tell me that the school have said that the child doesn't have a diagnosis, so they can't put X, Y, and Z support in place. And so there's a bit of misunderstanding. Not all schools, a lot of schools are fantastic with their additional support needs provision, and they do understand that it is needs-led and needs-based and not diagnosis-led at all. So the parents I work with, I tend to encourage them to bring to the school that actually this is the needs of my child, and I help them identify those needs and think about how those needs can be met in the school environment.
Trish, your microphone's gone on to mute.
Yeah, I did not do that.
I know there are gremlins around. That's great. Thank you. We can hear you again.
There are gremlins. Okay. I wonder, hold on actually a second. I wonder where just making sure I click somewhere other than the mic for this. Okay. Are you seeing my slide? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We can see that. It says options for education in Highland.
Yeah. Okay. So there are different options in Highlands and everywhere else, but these are specifically because of the virtual academy thing. These are around Highlands. So you've got your mainstream settings that everybody's aware of. You've got some specialist educational settings. There's the Highland Virtual Academy, which is just being in the process of being renamed and re-established as supporting interrupted learning. You've got home education, flexi-schooling, and some hybrid approaches. And we'll be looking at all of these today, some in more detail than others because I have a bit more expertise in some of these more than others. And my colleague who was presenting today had the expertise in the other areas. So we'll look at these. Yeah, there we are, as we go through the presentation. So we're going to start with mainstream settings. Now, what I would like to say about mainstream settings before we go any further is that the level of additional support needs in mainstream settings is increasing rapidly. I currently, as I said, work in Highlands. I teach in Highland. And the primary school so I teach nursery, primary and secondary. And the primary school that I work in has, at the moment, identified 40% additional support needs. Identified, which means there will be pupils in there who are struggling who have not been identified. And this doesn't, statistics are different in all schools and in all areas. And this is a real statistic that we're working with in the primary school that I have most recently been working in. And so if you're thinking about 40% of the pupils sitting in front of a teacher at any given time having an additional support need, so having some identified needs with strategies to meet those needs, and the teacher managing those within a classroom environment, it's really, really difficult sometimes to get that right. So let's think about the kind of supports that are available in mainstream settings. So you've got assistive technology, and there's a support service for that in Highland, but assistive technology can help a lot in schools, whether you use the support service or not. So that's about lots of things, right? So I'm not going to go massively into it, but in your mainstream schools, it's good that we use Chromebooks in Highland because some local authorities don't have these, and you have to have permissions to be able to use electronic devices for your main means of accessing education in a classroom. But we're quite progressive in Highland with that one. And so, but there's a lot of technology that can help young people. I spent a lot of time in my previous school, in my previous local authority, training young people on using assistive technology to do everything, to read, to write, to do everything for them, how to change background colour, how to do everything so that it really, really met a lot of their needs and removed a lot of the barriers for them before anything else was put in place. We also have child's plans and, of course, coordinated support plans, which we have in place to ensure the child's needs are met. And that's not always necessary. Sometimes it would be a Form 1 or a Form 2 in Highland. We have coloured dyslexia, coloured overlays. So it's a visual stress. If you have visual stress, it means that things happen with the text. It might be that the text jumps, that it vibrates, that it moves, that it fades in and out, and sometimes or just the glare from a white background on text really distorts things for you and gives you a headache and things. And so coloured overlays and coloured jotters and things really help with that. You can have a part-time timetable which means that you're not expected to attend school on a full-time basis due to difficulties you have. You can have an individualised education plan, which is different to a child's plan. It sets targets and it breaks them down into little achievable goals. So it's about working towards something in a different way than a child's plan does. A child's plan's about ensuring that the child's needs are being met and that there's actions being put in place to meet the needs of the child. You can have assessment arrangements put in place with the SQA exams to ensure that you do have, so if you do need coloured overlays, different background screens, if you need to be in separate accommodation, if you need extra time, all these different things can be put in place to ensure assistance. I do apologise if there's any background noise. There are nurture groups, and these are used, it varies. The use of nurture groups varies greatly dependent on staffing and resourcing around that. But nurture groups are a good way for young people to build their social skills, their interpersonal skills, and to have a safe space in the school to do that. You can have a personalised support document, and that's something I'm going to be looking at in a moment. What a lot of parents don't realise is that a child's plan is a confidential document. And so child's plans are usually stored in a confidential space within the school in a paper format, and they're usually stored in a confidential space electronically. So the access to child plans is limited just because of the kind of information that is included in child's plans. It can be quite, there can be a lot of confidential, highly confidential family things noted in child's plans. And so they are stored somewhere else. So a personalised support document is a good thing to have that can be in a space that's shared online for teachers. It's particularly useful in high schools and secondary schools, where there's multiple teachers working with any one young person as they go around the different classes in school. In a primary school, your primary teacher is more likely to see your child's plan and be aware of everything that's in there and on there and all the information. Whereas in a secondary school, your secondary teachers won't have access to those, and maybe your guidance teacher will, and the additional support needs teacher, the deputy head for additional support needs, the head teacher, and people like that, they'll have access to that document. But a support plan is something different. A support plan that we'll look at in a moment is about identifying very specifically the needs of the child and ensuring there's a support in place to meet each and every individual need, so that the teacher doesn't have to worry about how to meet that need. There's a plan in place, you know, and there's a consistent approach to meeting the needs of the child, and the child has been involved in the discussion around the support plan and how their needs are best met. You can have literacy or numeracy interventions. As we know, there can also be, so this is just small group interventions. They can be any kind of interventions, really. Sometimes emotional regulation, in fact, very often emotional regulation is a good intervention to have. And it can help with literacy and numeracy, because if you're not in a place to learn emotionally or mentally, then no amount of interventions is going to move you forward. You know, so addressing sometimes the emotional, the well-being needs of young people is the best initial intervention to put in place. You can also have, obviously, support workers like primary health workers and people who come in and out of schools. So these are all the kind of mainstream supports that you can have. There will be others that I just haven't remembered to put on the slide. And like I say, some schools do more of some than others do. It's not a one thing fits all. So there's the support differs depending on the resourcing available to the school. So within mainstream, what we try to do with supports is to put in as many reasonable adjustments as possible. So what is a reasonable adjustment? I thought, let's explore this a little bit. So you can have a personal reasonable adjustment, which is something that enables you as a young person to self-manage and self-regulate. And we'll look at some of these in a moment. I'll actually break down a template document on some of these, a high school template document. I've got templates for all different age groups. But personally, so to enable you to be able to manage that and to allow you the space to manage and self-regulate. There's practical supports, so to provide practical supports to enable pupil equity, and I'll speak about that a bit more in a moment. There's environmental support, so ensuring the environment is right and accessible, and very often getting your classroom to be an accessible classroom, you know, and if you are in primary, it's about having, you know, your visual timetables up. It's about having everything labelled so that nobody has to wonder where, you know, and keeping your visual timetable moving throughout the day. It's about having your background colour on your smart board to be slightly tinted or to use different coloured fonts that help the learners in the room. And so there's lots of little adjustments that you can make within the classroom generally and widely that will just ensure the environment's better for all learners, whether they have an identified additional support need or not. And then there's the teacher approach. And sometimes teacher approach, it's good to put things to do with how to approach things into a document, because if a teacher doesn't understand that this is a need, then they can misinterpret what the behaviour of the pupil is and why they're maybe behaving in that way. And so their approach might not be appropriate, but it's not their fault if the need is not identified. And so teacher approaches, if we can enhance relationships and prevent conflicts. Now I'm going to speak a tiny bit here about equity versus equality. Now equality was all the rage years ago when I first came into education. It was all about equality, equality, equality. And we've actually learned that equality is not the best way forward. Pupil equity is the best way forward, and equity within our society wider. And I had a head teacher down in West Lothian who kind of described this really, really well, in a way that captured, it just made me go, oh yeah, so equality, what she said was, if we think about equality and we're at the school sports day and wee Joey, who's got asthma, is running the race, and we're stood at the end of the race and we're giving him his inhaler because he needs his inhaler at the end of the race, and we give everybody an inhaler. That's equality. We ensure there's an inhaler there for everybody. That's equality. And that's, you know, it's a dumbing down of it, but that's equality. And what equality looks like. Equity looks like, wee Joey needs the inhaler and you don't. And so to get him on a level playing field to everyone else, to ensure that he gives the same opportunities and chances, then he needs that inhaler and you don't need that inhaler. And this can be a difficult one for young people in classrooms to understand, actually. Speaking from a teacher perspective, why that young person is getting to do this. They're getting to do this on their Chromebook, or they're getting this additional time when we're doing this piece of work, or they're getting this support, you know, they're getting a template, and why am I not getting that? And as well, because you don't have an identified need around that, actually, but this young person does. And so trying to ensure you're providing pupil equity and equity for your young learners, actually in an educational setting, whilst maintaining confidentiality on that young person's needs, is a tricky place to be. But definitely equality is the way forward. And I know that, equity is the way forward. And I know that there are equity funds and things like that now in education. So it is very recognised that there are people, because of their additional support needs, who are not on a level playing field to the other people in the classroom, the other learners. And it's our job to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity. Okay. Now this is just, we're not going to look at this, we're going to break this down. This is the kind of support documents that I like to produce and that are really, really handy for schools to have on a shared space. Now I'm just going to move on, I'll break it down further in here. Okay, so you would have your name in your support document, and it would have, I am autistic, I am dyslexic, or I have ADHD, or I am awaiting NDAS assessment, or whatever it is. So you would have whatever the need is highlighted in bold on the top, and the left-hand side is the way that I do these. And then just the bits that are very significant highlighted in the strategies moving forward. So if you have visual stress, for instance, you might struggle to read from a white background and use a yellow overlay in jotters. And this is very quick, that if a teacher opens the document, because it's highlighted, you can see, you can easily see, because it's highlighted, it quickly draws your eyes to the most important parts of the document. The reason these documents are so useful in mainstream settings, particularly in high schools, are that at any one point you can have a cover teacher come into, you could have several cover teachers in a day. Your cover teacher might be a supply teacher who is not aware of anyone in the school, or it could be a cover teacher from within the school who is just covering a class while they are on a non-teaching, non-contact period. And that teacher might never have met you. They might not know your needs. They might not know any of these things. And so having these documents in a shared space, there's also a way to share them on CMIS, under the ASN part of CMIS, and just put in the bolded parts of this. But and then they'd be available when you hover over the ASN block in your name. But anyway, regardless of whether they're on CMIS, which is the register, or not, having these in a shared space so that any teacher, any practitioner coming in to work with the child can access this and actually see their needs very, very clearly and very quickly, and not get that wrong, because it's important, especially with things like if you have sensory issues around clothing. So for younger people, it's very often that they just can't wear those tight things, or they can't have labels, or they can't, there's a lot of sensory issues around clothing. For older people in high school, I've tended to find that they like to sit with their hood up. It makes them feel more secure. It kind of helps them zone in a little bit and block out the overwhelmingness of the environment. So, but teachers, I have met teachers as well who, if they don't know this, and because other pupils are not allowed to sit with a hoodie on and a hood up, will tell them to take their hood down. And this, if they've put their hood up because they're distressed, you can imagine if you're getting told to take your hood down in that situation, you're going to get even more distressed. And so it doesn't help if this isn't identified. And these are little basic things. So again, this is about the teacher kind of attitude. So allowing me to, so the teacher doesn't know that this is a thing, then they might act inappropriately. But to identify it and say, this is a thing, don't question this pupil, on this is a means of self-regulation for them, then it's very, very helpful to have this in place. You might zone out regularly, or you might zone out when you're overwhelmed. That might be a thing for you. And if it is, what do you want? Do you want to discreetly? So for some people, it's like tap on my desk if you think I'm overwhelmed, discreetly, gently refocus me on my work. Always discreetly though. And I bold that in and put it in for teachers, because nobody wants to be shouted at across the room. Nobody wants to stand out for being, but especially when you're zoned out, struggling to focus for long periods of time. Now, it's been proven for young people, especially particularly with ADHD, but with neurodivergent young people, having music playing in one ear, so we've got one ear pod in, one ear pod out, or one headphone and the other one offset, so it's not covering your ear, so you can still always hear instruction, but having music playing into one ear massively improves focus for people for a majority of people who have ADHD. It won't work for everyone, because there is no hard and fast rule around any neurodivergent divergence. So you'll know that, and so, but for a lot of pupils, this is a thing that works really, really well. It allows them to focus on their work. The main thing being, don't be sitting with your phone out, don't be scrolling through trying to find songs, it's very, very discreetly done. Your phone's in your bag, you've got one ear pod in, and you're not sitting singing along or anything like that. It's about hearing, and that that distraction allows you to focus on the piece of work that you have in front of you. Works really well. If you're not neurodivergent, you'll know that it just doesn't work. Actually, the music itself is a distraction. Okay, so again, a lot of neurodivergent people are very caught up in their own experience at any one given time, and they might not always realise how their behaviour is affecting other people in the room. And that can be for all ages, you know, it's not only really young people, and especially people with ADHD as well. So you're impulsive, you react, and your reactions can be very impulsive, and because of that, they're not thought through. So sometimes you will do things that has an impact on other people around you. So to get into a lot of trouble for that, when actually this is part of your makeup, you can't help this. You're not deliberately doing this. This is part of what you have going on. So to get into trouble for that is quite unfair. So instead, I'm saying, you know, discreetly clarify how my behaviour is affecting others and explain that consequential thinking, you know. So when you've done this, this has caused this, and I know you didn't mean it, but actually it's caused this, so that you can still have a degree of speaking to the child about what has happened, but you're taking away the massive blame element, because it's, you know, not something that they were able to control very often. And it is about also discerning between what is neurodivergent behaviour and what is teenage behaviour. And when I worked in an ASN department, in a neurodivergent unit for 3 years, taught in there, and we used to always say that having a neurodivergence is not, you know, being neurodiverse is not an excuse for bad behaviour. It's not an excuse for being rude. And we used to say this to people all the time. So we understand that there are ways and things that will happen, but actually it's not an excuse for being rude, for being bad-mannered, you know, and for misbehaving. And so, yeah, so we were always trying to separate the teenager part of the child from the other behaviours. And so maybe they need very clear language and don't understand sarcasm or humour or banter, even though they can give it out. And so this is about, you know, keeping things very clear for them. I've got a lot of anecdotal stories around neurodivergent learners who had teachers who were very funny teachers, very nice teachers that a lot of people really liked, but they didn't like them, and it's because they continually made quips about their name, maybe, you know. I had a pupil whose surname was Gunn, and the teacher was always making quips about that, and because everyone laughed, that pupil felt that they were laughing at them, and did not want to go into that environment, and got very upset about it. And so it's about understanding how these things can affect young people with additional support needs. May not always engage eye contact, common one. Know I'm listening, or check that I'm listening, even if I'm not looking at you. So don't demand eye contact. I've met so many parents in my time who have said that their child is being chastised for not making eye contact. And maybe they don't have a diagnosis, and so the teacher hasn't understood, but actually we need to identify the need in there as well, you know. So regardless of whether there's a diagnosis or not, like we said at the start, if there's a need in this is a part of a behaviour for this child, they do not make eye contact, then we need to identify that and just understand, so we can see how none of these really involve a lot of work for staff, for a teacher. It's just about understanding someone's behaviour and where someone is, and either giving them the space to self-regulate, or you having the right approach with them to allow them that space to self-regulate. And so there's no really huge bits of, or getting the environment right for them and ensuring that the environment is set up for them to be able to thrive and feel safe and be themselves, really, in a classroom. And classrooms are changing, and they need to change a little bit more just to get up to speed with this. So again, I may have zoned out, and I may not actually have tuned into what you're saying. So use my name or tap my desk, or whatever the strategy is for getting a young person's attention if they have zoned out. Change and transitions is a huge one. And so processing change and transitions, processing generally, but processing change and transitions can be huge. So pre-warn me. And then there's going to be instances where that isn't possible, you know. So in high schools again, or in primaries, you might go in and you've got a cover teacher that you don't know, and there's been no chance of pre-warning you of that because maybe the school didn't find out until that morning that the teacher wasn't coming in, and they're rallying around trying to backfill this space. And so you've not known, and you've gone in and there's a cover teacher, and that can be a big trigger for a lot of young people. But where you can pre-warn of change, then do that, you know, give a lot of transition time, give a lot of processing time, and understand that for young people has been a huge thing. Noisy and busy environments are difficult, so they can often trigger anxiety or that overwhelm and meltdown kind of mentality thing that goes on for young people a lot. And so pre-warn me of unexpected noise and allow me to opt out is one way. Or for some young people, it's allow me out 5 minutes before my peers get out for break and lunch so that I can access the canteen while it's still quite quiet and it's not busy, crowded and noisy. I can access the canteen, I can get what I want, and then I can be wherever I'm going to be to have my break and my lunchtime without having to feel the way that I do when I'm in that space with everyone else. You know, so there's, like I say, this isn't a one fits all. This is an example of something, and this is a kind of high school, an S1 kind of example, building into S2 and S3 as we move through it towards exams and thinking about those kinds of things. But I've got templates for all age groups, and if anyone's in here who is from an education background and they would like the templates, then I would welcome you to get in touch with me and I will share these with you. Again, so struggling to structure work now. A lot of young people who are neurodivergent struggle to make a start on a blank piece of paper. They just, where do you start, you know? They've been given instruction, and the teachers told them that this is what I need you to do, and they've been quite clear about it. So it's not that the instruction's not clear, it's just that I actually don't know what to write first, don't know, and sometimes there's a perfectionist thing in there as well, and I don't want to get this wrong. I've known a lot of young people who have torn up huge amounts of work because they've made an error, and so they don't want to get it wrong. So what can you do? Can you talk them through it a bit more? Can you provide a template? Can you start sentences for them? Sometimes I would play devil's advocate and I would sit and I'd say to them, well, I would start it by saying this. And they would say, oh, that's not me. And I would say, well, what is you then? Oh, I'm more like that. Well, there you go. That's how you're going to start it. And sometimes it's just about having that kind of conversation and allowing that time, or giving them an actual template, depending on the learner. And again, you need to know your learners. You need to know the people in front of you and what works for them. So some of them like to be on the go. So ADHD kids, trying to sit and settle in a classroom environment can be so difficult. So allow them to doodle, to fidget if they're really little, if they're young and they're in primary, maybe they've got a little sensory pack, and I encourage some parents to give them a sensory pack to take to school in their school bag that they can pull out. And it's little sensory fidget toys that don't make a noise. So there's a nice little one that's in it's a textured piece of material, and it's got a marble in it, and it just, you know, you can roll this marble back and forward in there. Or little things that are made of the kind of loom band rubbery things, you know, so things that don't make a noise but will allow them to sit and fidget. Because if they have ADHD, they're more likely to pay attention to you if they're sitting doodling or fidgeting than they are if you're trying to make them look like they're paying attention. It just doesn't work. So we need to be aware of all these ways that young people's needs are met, and ensure that we're putting the correct things in place to meet them. And so handwriting can be slow, it can be poor, it can be messy. There's maybe fine motor difficulties there. There's maybe processing difficulties. There's all sorts of things that can go on. So give me an electronic device for longer pieces of work and in tests and exams. So this is just getting young people used to. And sometimes I'll say my handwriting can be slow and I prefer to type. And the thing is, allow me to practice typing. So if they're in primary school and they're a bit younger, allow me to practice typing so that they get a bit more keyboard savvy, because this is the way forward in high school for these learners. So again, I mean, this does eventually stop. I'll try not to go through this too much, but this is the thing that I'm most comfortable with out of all of what I'm sharing with you today, is how to identify needs and how to support them in a reasonable way within a classroom environment. So people will tend not to have all of these, you know, you'll rarely have a pupil who has like a 5-page document, for instance. You know, it's usually it's about keeping it concise, as concise as we can do, and ensuring that the strategy meets the area requiring support, so it meets the need, and it does it in a way that does have minimal adjustment for the teacher, because like I said, you can imagine having 10 pupils in a classroom who all have identified additional support needs and all have a support document. And so the clearer we can make this and the more manageable we can make it, then the more likely it is that it's going to be met and within the classroom environment and manageable for the teacher to meet. And a lot of these are not continued use things. So if spelling's difficult, allow them to use spell check. And it's important that we identify this for high school pupils, because the SQA will allow you to use electronic devices. They will allow you to have digital papers, for instance. They will allow you to have an electronic device for reading or for writing, for speak to text. They'll allow you to have someone to write, to scribe for you. There's lots of things that can be done. But if it's not identified, then it's not granted. And if it's part of a support plan, an ongoing support plan that's been in place for years, then the need is there, and that's your evidence. So you don't have to get a pupil to do a piece of work that they can't manage to show that they can't manage it, which some schools, believe it or not, have done, because there's not a document like this in place that says this is a continued strategy and support that's been in place for this young person to meet a need over a number of years. And so spell check will be removed from all electronic devices that you're allowed to use in SQA exams if it's not identified that you need spell check. So it's important to have all these little things in as well. And some of these don't affect an everyday classroom environment, because your own Chromebook, for instance, will have spell check devices in use on it. But it is important to have it in here for those greater times. So sometimes your reading can be slow or poor. What I also experience a lot, and again in the neurodivergent, dyslexic, autistic or ADHD population, is that their reading is really not poor or slow. Actually, they are fantastic readers a lot of the time, but they're not taking it in. They're reading it, they can read it really, really well. And you think their reading's brilliant until you're doing an assessment with them and you realise that much as they've read that, they haven't actually taken it in, and they have to read it again and again, or read it really, really slowly to take it in and absorb the information. Sometimes they read to the end of a sentence and they have to think what that sentence was to be able to get it to store in their brain, and do the same at the end of each paragraph. So, and sometimes it's good to have a human or an electronic reader that can read for them. It allows them to read it, look at it, to see it and to hear it at the same time. And sometimes, you know, that having both of those things in place can help the processing. Sometimes it doesn't. So it's about finding out what works for that young person. So getting extra time in exams, losing focus in high pressured situations. Oh yes, sometimes the noise in the exam hall of pencils or pens on paper is a real trigger for some people, and they just can't, it affects their processing massively, and they can't focus or concentrate. So they would need separate accommodation. If you've got a human prompt, if you need any of these things, you're going to be in a separate accommodation space anyway, but it's good to have it all written out. Multiple instructions. Teachers are really good at saying, so when you finish that, right, we're going to do this next time. When you finish that, we're going to move on to this. And like we say, having that displayed somewhere, or just giving one instruction at a time. And the same with parents at home, the amount of parents that I do an educational plan with, and when we've done the education, as we're doing the educational plan, they'll be like, oh yeah, I do that in the morning, actually. You know, I'm always like, no, you need to get your teeth brushed and you need to do this, and you need to get your jacket on, and then you need to get your, and I'm giving them more than one instruction at a time, and they're just not doing it, or they're very confused, or it takes them ages, and it's because they're processing and trying to really, really hold on to what is it that you want me to do. So one instruction at a time, bite-sized instructions, because remember, their processing and their working memory is just not going to be able to deal or cope with more than that. And so again, they can be bored, struggle to keep up with things, give them printed electronic notes. A lot of this looks quite obvious, yeah? But actually, if it's not there, and it's not written down, and it's not identified, then it can be a cause of great distress for the young person, because the need's not being met and the teacher doesn't quite understand the need as well. And like I said, they can act in a way that's not helpful when it's not their fault because the need's not been identified. And so to get these kinds of things teased out is really, really helpful. The homework one, home is home and school is school. And so limiting homework is really good for young people. They will struggle a lot of the time to remember it, but they will also struggle to engage with it. So a lot of young people who are neurodivergent really, really struggle to engage with homework at home, because home is my safe space. It's not my space that I do any of this stuff in. And so limiting homework for neurodivergent learners is a great way forward, actually. This one, difficult to speak out in front of the class. The amount of schools I have been in where teachers are still just pointing at pupils and asking them to read aloud, or asking them what they think of this, or saying, can you repeat back to me what we've just learned? Can you tell me what? And putting these pupils on the spot. So processing difficulties are a thing for a lot of pupils that we haven't even identified as having additional support needs. Then processing difficulties are a thing. We're seeing a lot of anxiety in the younger population of children than we ever saw before as well in schools. And so putting young people on the spot to do these things, if they have any kind of anxiety issues, reading difficulties, processing difficulties, just is not a good thing to do. So don't ask me to read feedback or answer questions aloud in front of my peers unless I volunteer. Ask for a volunteer. There's always going to be people that want to do these things in your classroom. And actually picking out people is not a helpful way forward at all, especially because a lot of needs aren't identified. So you're still going to catch some people who don't have this kind of support in place. Okay, now I was going to speak a little bit about specialist settings, and I'm aware that this is us just coming up to an hour. So right, so I'll give us 4 minutes break and we'll come back at 11 o'clock and continue the presentation then, if that's okay. And we'll just have a little look at specialist settings and things from then on. Hello everyone, are we back and can you see my slide? Can someone please let me know?
Yeah, Trish, that's great. We can see you and your slide, thank you.
Okay, so I've managed to get myself a little bit of water. I've heard that there's a lot of questions going into the chat. And just to kind of briefly say that anyone can contact Thriving Families and ask for a family support worker to help them with these kinds of things. And like I said, if there's anyone from education here who would like to speak to me specifically, you can also get in touch with me through Thriving Families. So contact them and they will forward your email to me. I'm happy to help in any way I can for anyone that I can help with as well. Okay, so we're just going to move on and look at specialist settings. Where is my mouse? Oh, there it is. Okay, so what is a specialist setting? Well, it is specifically that. It is designed to facilitate a particular type of education around complex additional support needs. And it's used for when there are significant presenting barriers to accessing a mainstream setting. What are the settings in Highland Council then? So we have these 5 settings in Highland Council. I'm going to admit that I'm not entirely up to speed with what these are, and my colleague was more up to speed with these things than I am. But what I do know is that they are all oversubscribed. So specialist settings tend to work in a ratio of staff to pupils that mainstream settings don't work on. And because of that, the amount of pupils in the intake for these schools is really, really small. And I know that most parents of young people with additional support needs want their child in a specialist setting. And I know that because I work with them all the time. And they'll say my child's needs can't be met in a mainstream setting. And I always say, okay, let's try and get the relationship with the school in a good place, and let's try and put as many supports in place as we can, and let's identify them by need and the support. And that's why I spent so much time going through that last thing. I know that it's not going to fit everyone, but trust me, I do have a way of identifying the needs individually and identifying the supports that meet the needs. And that has been my bread and butter for many years. And so I do think that a lot of the time when parents are saying my child cannot manage mainstream school, what I hear is the correct support has never been put in place for my child to be allowed to manage mainstream school, to be given the space for that self-regulation and the adjustments that they need to make, and the things have not been put in place for them around the school. And so sometimes it is actually a lot more manageable than it can seem or feel. And it is just about getting it right. And it's not easy to get it right because of the level of needs in schools, like I've said. But it's also, that doesn't mean that the right thing is one of these specialist provisions. Okay, because it very often isn't the right thing for your child. But here are what I know to be the 5 specialist settings within the Highland Council. Okay, and this is them. I'm right now sitting in the Pines, so of course I'm at Drummond. So I do know a little bit about Drummond, and I don't know much about the rest of them, although I do believe that the work that was going to be happening at St Clement's School has now been pulled. So I don't know where that leaves us. But like I said, it's not always the right thing for your child anyway to be in one of these specialist settings. And the likelihood of gaining a placement in these is very slim because of the small numbers of children that they work with and because of the amount of requests that come forward. Okay. So how does a young person access a specialist setting? Well, it's through the JAG, the Joint Advisory Group, and they also look at the specialist bases in mainstream schools. Now, if it's a specialist base, then it also works in a different ratio for additional support needs and staff than a school that just has an ASN department, for instance. So I have worked in a huge high school with 1,200 pupils, and we had an additional support needs department and several classrooms in there. We weren't a unit or a base that was officially recognised, which meant that we had much larger numbers of child to staff ratios than you would have in a school that has a designated like hub or ASN provision. So they usually exist. The ASN departments exist in all schools. All secondary schools will have somewhere that they use, but some of them have a very, very specific space. Yeah. So the way to get into, or the way to request this, is through the Joint Advisory Group. So the Joint Advisory Group is headed by your Additional Support Needs Officer. So your Additional Support Needs Manager positions no longer exist in Highland Council, and that structure is actually currently it's fluid. It's currently being remodelled. And I'll show you what it kind of looks like in a bit, where it is at the moment, but it is in a state of flux, and so it's being remodelled, and so is all of this. And so they meet on a quarterly basis, but again, this is currently being looked at. So this can change. This can change quite frequently at the moment, actually, because the entirety of additional support needs and the structure around that is at the moment, it's a really difficult time to be doing this kind of presentation because it is in a state of remodelling with Highland Council. And so you would make a submission via the lead professional. So a child's plan has a lead professional and a named person. So the lead professional in there would be the person to go to and speak to about putting forward a request to the Joint Advisory Group. So child plan meetings and core meetings involve parents, carers, schools, and other relevant professionals, and those relevant professionals might be speech and language therapists, they might be educational psychologists, primary health workers, social workers, there might be health visitors, there might be occupational health and occupational therapists, and these kinds of people. So these are the lead professionals involved, but you would usually go through your lead professional and get your request into the Joint Advisory Group. And from there, you will get a letter. It will be from Bill Couston, who is the senior lead manager of additional support for learning in Highland Council, and it will be sent on behalf of the Education Authority. Not necessarily Bill himself sending it, but this is who it's sent on behalf of. Okay, so this is how you make a request. This is how you would access it. Like I say, it's not always the right thing though. So this is everything else that exists. So these are all the other little ways. So there's mainstream education, there's specialist education, and then there's these other things that exist in Highland and in other education authorities. So there's the Highland Virtual Academy, which is just being renamed, as I said, as the Supporting Interrupted Learning Service, I suppose. And so this was founded way back, and it was just to access qualification level courses for student populations that were too small to have that provided, yeah, to have an actual location-based centre. But then during COVID, obviously this expanded, and there were students who had interrupted learning due to shielding, and it further expanded because of reasons other than COVID. So just for pupils who are too anxious, they're highly anxious, they can't attend school, they've maybe been already gone from full-time attendance down to a part-time timetable, they're maybe struggling with that as well, and Highland Virtual Academy can be suggested as a way forward. Now, Highland Virtual Academy, the bridge is now, so the bridge that we looked at in the last screen is now part of the Highland Virtual Academy, and as of this month, is to be known as Supporting Interrupted Learning, and it is only accessible moving forward via the JAG team. So that is via the Joint Advisory Group. So this same way. So this is the Joint Advisory Group information in here. So that is how it's now accessible. So, and here are the people in charge. So it's got a head teacher and a guidance teacher. And again, this is another thing that's in flux just now, and this might change. So the information that I give you today is what I know today. And because this is being reviewed at the moment, this entire part of education in Highland is being reviewed at the moment, then it's a kind of slippery grip that I've got on what's going on. So this is, to the best of my knowledge at the moment, this is where we are. Okay. So who can home educate? Well, actually, you can choose to home educate instead of putting your child into a school. You don't have to be a teacher or have anything like that in place, but you need to be able to provide an efficient education for your child, and it has to be like age and stage suitable. So what kind of parents do this? Well, all sorts of parents decide they're going to do this. A lot of parents decide they're going to home educate, I have to say, in my own personal experience, and then realise that it's difficult. It's difficult to implement, and a lot of parents do it and think, gosh, this is so much easier than I thought. So it's it's different for everyone who decides to try this. Highland Council website says that you don't have to follow the traditional school curriculum. You don't have to use a fixed timetable. that keeps to school hours and terms, but you do have to show that your education is suitable to your child and it's got a lot of variety, it's resourced, and your child has access to other children, so they're not like being kept at home. So they are getting out into the wider world. And there can be a lot of experiential learning in there. And there's a little link in here to what Highland Council does say, where all this information comes from on the Highland Council website. Okay, so how do you go about this one? Well, you've got to get consent to withdraw from the school that you're in. And that is if you're already enrolled in a local authority school. So not all children are enrolled in local authority schools. So you would normally withdraw by writing to your ASN officer. And try and do that quite far in advance to when you want to withdraw them. So you would tend to not withdraw and then write. So it's a process. So it's a process that you would engage with. And your child might not be attending school, but they're still enrolled at a school, and so you've still not withdrawn them, whether your child is attending or not. So if your child is still on that school roll, then that's fine. They're not withdrawn from school. You would include your initial proposals for how you're going to do this, how you're going to make this education suitable for your child, what you're going to do. So what the model's going to look like for you, and you would also say why you wanted to withdraw them from school. It's not required, it says, but it is a good idea to do that, because that might be a question that comes back to you. So if you initially put that into your request, then you're just kind of cutting down the time of to and froing, really. Scottish Government says that you should get a response within 6 weeks of your original request if you ensure the things are all, the appropriate information is in the request. And until that consent is granted, Highland Council prefers for your child to attend school and remain enrolled in school, even if your child is unable to attend. Because I know for a lot of parents who do choose home education, it's because they cannot get their child to attend school because their needs are not being met, and the child is now in a position of overwhelm and school refusal. And so keep them enrolled for as long as you can throughout this process, because it really helps. You know, they have to be known and within the system. So when consent is not required, very rarely is consent not required, but if the child has never attended a public school or has never attended a school in that local authority area, if they've been withdrawn from an independent school, if they've finished primary education in one school but not yet started secondary, or if the school that they're attending is being closed. However, what I want to say about those last two, and actually also possibly I've put an asterisk, as you can see, possibly also if the child's never attended a public school in that school's local authority area, but they have attended a public school elsewhere, I would probably also say about them, pupils are very often automatically enrolled into the receiving school when they're transitioning. So for transition from primary to secondary, transition from one local authority into another, or transition when a school is being closed into a different school. So these are all transitions that the school would always try and put in place actually an enrolment. So it might be that that enrolment is automatically going to happen. So be very careful of that. So this is, we can see where this has come from in the Scottish Government information, but actually there is a process that is in place in most schools to just automatically transition and enrol pupils to a receiving school. Okay. So there is although there's no statutory duty on parents to inform the local authority that your home education, if you don't require consent, it is actually still in your best interest, and Highland Council and other education authorities prefer if you contact them and do let them know. Otherwise, it's like, where is this child and what is going on? And there's no accountability in there for the education. So what contact will you have with the council if you home educate? So the education officer will contact the family on at least an annual basis, and you can choose to provide information in a meeting or in writing. You can choose to provide that either way you like. The young person's views are welcome, just as with child's planning and everything else in education. The child is at the centre of all of these things. So it's not about what the parent feels is most important, but the child is also recognising their own needs and their own desires within this, and their views are welcomed. You can request more frequent contact with the council and your education officer, especially if there are concerns about home education. And they can also request that, so it's a two-way thing. You can request more and they can request more, especially if they have concerns. And so if a concern has been identified and you have improved, the parent has improved, failed to improve things, they can make an attendance order. So if there's an order put upon the family, it gives you 14 days to provide the council with the information about whatever it is that the order is around, to get that to the education officer. And if it's not done, the child will be expected to return to school. And so all that information again is in the link that we provide there. So moving on, you'll see that there are little references at the end of each of these, and there's a slide towards the end with the links to these references. So the Highland Council, this is very important actually for young people who have additional support needs. There is no legal responsibility to provide additional support when your child is educated at home. So that can be speech and language, occupational therapy, NDAS assessments and stuff like that. So the Highland Council or any council can choose to provide additional support, but they are not legally required to do so. Now, that is something that parents find difficult to understand and accept. So it could be that trying to engage speech and language and occupational therapy is very difficult because you don't have that direct through school route. Okay, and there's no responsibility, no legal responsibility to provide that. Local authority may not unreasonably withhold consent. Okay, so they can't withhold consent to you homeschooling unreasonably, and they should notify parents in writing of their decisions and set out reasons and grounds for refusal if it is withheld. Okay. And again, parents are given the opportunity to address the grounds for refusal and resubmit the request for consideration. So there is this, a ground for appeal, really. To resubmit, look at what they've said the reasons are. That's why I said try and make that initial request as robust as you can do, because there may be reasons and you don't want to do the to and fro if you can avoid it. There is no statutory right to appeal against the decision to withhold consent, but all decisions will be reviewed, okay, or should be reviewed internally on request, and parents should be given the details of the official complaint procedure. And a young person's rights under My Rights, My Say still apply if they're home educated. So you do still have rights as a child when you're home educated. You just don't automatically have access to additional support and the services around additional support. There are ways to access them, but it's not a legal responsibility. And the accessing of these, like I say, because it normally comes from the school, is a bit more complex. So let's think about flexi-schooling. So flexi-schooling is a full-time education arrangement between you, the parent and guardian, and the Highland Council ASN officer, where you split your week up. And so some of it might be in a physical school setting and some of it is in a home setting for education. And there should be a good balance of the two, yeah. And reviewing the young person's needs. So this is a way to have your child's needs met and be able to access all those things if they have additional support needs, but also be able to do some schooling at home. I have some young people on my caseload at Thriving Families who are doing flexi-schooling, and they're flexi-schooling in their home and not in the school, but in a community building that the school are accessing to help support them with their education. So they're getting workers, so they're getting staff members from school engaging with them in a community building, and they're also working from home. So that, but it's normally normally you would be engaging some of the time in school, in your actual school building, and the rest would be at home. Learners are registered as full-time with the school and are fully funded. So this is an easier way to access, like I said, additional support needs, support, or pupils who do not want to be in school full-time rather than home education full-time. This is an easier way to access those things. Who's entitled to request it? All parents or guardians are allowed to request flexi-schooling as an alternative to mainstream education, and they do not have to have an identified additional support need. So your child does not need to have that identified for you to be able to request this. So this is a good thing to look into. How do you request it? You go through your head teacher of your school if possible. Sometimes the head teacher can make an informal agreement, yeah, with you, and the head teacher can approve that. But the head teacher may also ask you to formally apply to the Highland Council to do that. So it just depends, and it depends probably on a lot of things around what's already in place for that child, if the child is already known to be having difficulties, and it's down to each head teacher actually. So the head teacher can, like I say, agree that and approve it, or ask you to make a formal application. If you need to make a formal application, you send a letter to the education officer to request the flexi schooling. You say your reason, the initial thoughts around how it will work. So initial thoughts around how it will work. It's not very prescribed, flexi schooling. It's not as prescribed as homeschooling. You know, you don't have to go into as much detail because there is still the engagement with school and education. And the area education officer, again, has 6 weeks to respond to you. You can contact us to help you with this, or any of these things that we've been speaking about. We are less involved with families who home, or I give less support to families who home educate, and it's basically because of that kind of grey area. But flexi schooling is becoming a bit more popular for families who struggle to get their young people into school at all or full time. So what you can do is you can do a combination of all of these things. There could be some mainstream, there could be some flexi schooling. You can obviously opt for homeschooling. You can go to Highland Virtual Academy or supporting interrupted learning, as it's now called, and you can have a mix of these to be able to access something that suits you, your child's needs, and the school, and whatever they can provide. But it's good to always, wherever possible, I promote and work towards restoring, if needed, positive relationships with the school. It's your easiest way to access education, your easiest way to access any support around additional support needs. And so, like I say, a lot of times you do get into this place where there's a bit of a stick. You've hit a spot and things don't seem to be progressing in the right direction. And that's in those moments, it's really, really good to contact a service like Thriving Families and see what help we can provide in moving things forward to promote a positive relationship with school, to ensure your child's needs are met within the school environment and the wider home and community environments, and to make sure that you feel supported throughout that process. We do work quite a lot, I would like to say, along with partners in advocacy. So I can provide a lot of support and advice and information, and partners in advocacy can come into, if you request a partner, an advocate through partners in advocacy, they can come into a meeting with you and I ahead of any meetings with the school, whether it's a child's plan meeting or just a solution focus meeting or any kind of meeting with the school. And they can be there to advocate on your behalf within the meeting. I don't do that, but they can do that. But I can be there to set up everything prior to that. I can help with emails that you might send to the school to request these kinds of supports and things like that as well. So, and the Thriving Families team generally is quite a formidable team actually of individuals who can help you, and we all have our own little specialisms in there for engaging with, and our resource coordinator Leslie is really good at triaging people who come to thriving families to put them with the best family support worker to meet their needs, or whatever it is that they're bringing to us. Okay, now I'm just sharing with you here like I say, this is currently under review, and it has been reviewed, and this is the latest education and learning service structure, the latest, but may not be the official. I mean, this can change. This is in a state of flux. It's in a state of review, like I said, and so this can also change. So I would take this as being correct today. And I don't know about that much further forward, but this is looking at the individual areas. So overall, who's in charge, breaking it down into the individual areas and looking at who is managing and who are officers within each area around Highland. Okay, so I'm going to have time. I've got half an hour. We can either finish early or I can take some questions. Here's how you would contact us. It's all going to be in the slides. The slides are going to be made available. And these are the references for the home education references that were on slide 23. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing this with you now and take